Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's our pleasure to begin one more Researchers Excellence Network event, which was organized together with the Department of Public Administration in Šiauliai University, Lithuania. Dear colleagues, we have today a big honor to welcome professor from University of Nebraska in Omaha, Professor Ethel Williams, who has more than 25 years experience in public administration in this specific scientific field. And today, she is going to speak about one of the most confusing, I would say, issue methodology of public administration researchers. So, Professor, we are giving the floor for you. It's our pleasure to see you and to welcome you in Šiauliai University. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for coming, for those of you who are in the room and for those of you who are connecting via ReNet. I welcome you as well. Thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for your invitation. It has been very wonderful being in Lithuania again. Lots of changes have occurred in Lithuania since I was here 4 years ago, and so I'm very excited to learn the new things. This presentation is not heavily theoretical because what I have found in more than really now 30 years of experience in research in public administration is that we get all of the theory that we need relative to research methodology. What we don't get is a lot of emphasis on how we take that methodology and use it practically to move our research projects from a concept in our mind to an actual paper, article, book. Those sorts of things as researchers, we learn through trial and error. I find that having worked one-on-one with doctoral students over the years, the hardest part is taking what they think is an idea, a topic, a research area, and really addressing what they want to address. In my own personal dissertation, I spent an entire year trying to find a theoretical foundation. I read, I made notes on well over 100 articles, and I found myself one Sunday afternoon with all of these papers around me in the middle of a floor, categorizing them and then dumping almost 80% of them, recognizing that perhaps I needed that journey, but more than that, had I had a tool that helped me think through how I was going to address my topic, maybe it wouldn't have taken me a year to get to that point. So, what we're going to talk about is today the nature of public administration research, looking at its multi as well as interdisciplinary nature, the challenge of applying what is taught to us in terms of research methodology and addressing a concise concept of a research question. We're going to look at some practical examples from my own research where I took 2 different approaches with a colleague in addressing topics. Then we're going to try to interact as much as possible. That might be challenging given the fact that some of you are on ReNet, so we may be depending on you in the room for some questions and answers. We know that every scientific profession rests on a foundation or infrastructure of research and research methods. Those methods are not very different in terms of their structure, in terms of the way information is looked at. What we find that in our field of public administration that is still being challenged scientifically. Is it really a discipline? Is it really a scientific discipline because of the nature of our research? what we're finding is that with the complexity of problems in not only government, but now nonprofit organizations, we need to find a more concise way of addressing the issues and finding answers. Research in the field of public administration is complicated by the fact that it is both multidisciplinary, meaning that we combine or involve a number of academic disciplines in the way we approach our study. We also find that it's interdisciplinary, meaning that the branches of knowledge, whether it is positivism, relativism, or pragmatism in our approaches, really impact how we do research, what methods we use, how we answer questions. In a discipline that uses all of that, how do we come very concisely to a manner of answering the questions that we have? Some of the areas that we find that relate and that we use in our discipline for research include the following scientific areas. Sociology. An example is looking at bureaucracy, looking at people, looking at the actions of people in organizations. Economics, supply and demand, a very new area of research. Supply chain management, how one area impacts another in management. Social welfare, which deals with public participation. Early theorists such as Mary Parker Follett was one of the first people who was an American to look at people's participation, citizens participating in the policies that are made for them, the decisions that are made for them. Also a part of the nature of our research. Business, manufacturing, and engineering tailors one best way of doing things. It's one of the foundational theories of public administration. So thinking about all these approaches and ways of thinking about things, I found to be very challenging for some doctoral students. Finally, psychology, motivation. As one of my specializations is human resources management. So an area of study is what motivates workers. How are workers motivated? So I have to draw from the field of psychology and their approach to doing research, but I also have to translate it into a way that's understandable if I'm working for practitioners or if I'm attempting to broaden an understanding of a particular theoretical approach in public administration. When you put all this together, how do you ever get to a question that is doable or an approach that is doable in research? Gill and Meyer, doing a study of the broad way that we do research in the field of public administration, came to the decision in their article that as a discipline, we rely too much on other disciplines. However, as a research methodology, we don't have our own because our decisions have to include how it translates to implementation or into policy, how it translates into helping academics grow the field of understanding. The United Nations Department of Public Administration and Management in 2000 did an extensive piece on methodology. And if you look at that piece summarily, what they found was that the disciplines that public administration borrow from are often interested in different types of questions than we are interested in. So if we're using their research methodologies or approaches, whether it is a positivist approach that says empirically you have to prove everything with data. It may work, it may not work. You use a pragmatist approach or postmodern approach where you have to make sure of the impact on citizens. Something very different is called for. Can we eliminate any of these theoretical approaches to research methodology? We cannot. So, this is the basic research model for every scientific discipline, whether it is chemistry, whether it is political science, whether it's public administration, whether it is sociology, that there is observation and data collection. That's very clear to all of us. These are the things that are taught in our research methods classes. There are excellent texts that teach us how to observe data, how to collect data in our doctoral programs around the world. We are taught how to interpret data, how to analyze data, then how to take the data that we have collected, understand it, and find results that we can share with others. That's true across the board. But how and what model do we use to observe the data? If we're looking at a question of a political science nature, can we take the theoretical approach that economists use? Sometimes we really can. Sometimes we can't. It's difficult sometimes to discern. As I said earlier, the research processes are the very same. Each discipline has its own approach to bringing together or formulating and answering questions. As an interdisciplinary field, which discipline do we choose and when do we choose it? Doctoral and master's students in public administration are taught very detailed information on how to plan your research project, on how to go about doing the things that we talked about in the previous slide, collecting data for the research project, and many other things. But the perspective and approach from which research projects are designed, implemented, and methodological skills are often left to the student. You have an idea of what you want to do. You have these great tools that you have been taught in sometimes several research courses. The doctoral students in my School of Public Administration in Omaha have two research courses, one that is qualitative, one that is quantitative, using empirical techniques. But neither of those classes actually do this. How do you take what you know and make your project work in a manner that is usable without, as I said, I did, spending an entire year trying to figure it out. So, is there a research methodology unique to solving the questions of government and public administration? Lots of research has been done just on that topic. Okay? How should research questions in public administration be conceptualized? Well, as I said in the overview, this is going to be how we go back, take the methods and skills that we have in observing data, in collecting data, in the processes that we use to analyze and interpret the data. How do we at the very beginning know how to think about and conceptualize this? So this is what I am addressing for the rest of this time, this very practical approach. I'd really like to say that I thought of this all by myself as a wonderful researcher because I am so very smart. No, I did not. Over the years, what I found is in my own working with students, in my own research on the theories of public administration and how to observe them, I actually found an article written only less than 10 years ago, in 2008, by Samuel Yeager, who is an American public administration professor and theorist, who found that he had been challenged the same way that I had been challenged with my students. So he presented and helped to develop, by pulling from other colleagues, not necessarily a model, but what I would call a checklist to help you use the methodological skills you already have to create and present a project that is useful to you in your research. So it is that model that we will be talking about for the rest of this hour. So how do you think about research questions given our eclectic nature of our discipline? All research courses teach, when you think about or developing your research questions, the following areas. What's the purpose of doing the research? Research for undergraduates are very different. I had a colleague say in a joking manner once that often undergraduates in his history course would go to an encyclopedia or go to other secondary sources and find data about, or biographical data about a person, and they would just pick and choose from that, and when they had reached their page limit, it would be the end of the paper, say the end. That's not how we do it at the master's or doctoral level. That's really not how we do it at the baccalaureate level. But that was said to say there's not the sophisticated way of determining where you're going with a project. Is the purpose of your research just to inform practitioners? Is the purpose of your research to further an existing theory? Is the purpose of your research to question an existing theory? If we think this through before actually starting our project, it helps. What is a research problem? You're taught that in almost all research design courses. I dare to say every research design course teaches what a research problem is from a theoretical perspective. In doing your research, who needs the information? Are you doing it just as a class project? Are you doing it again to further the literature in the field? Who really needs this information? What research design should you use? We're taught in research methods courses that there are certain designs for certain kinds of situations and projects, whether we use a survey methodology, whether we use a qualitative approach in just reviewing the literature to say what others have said about the area that you are investigating. How should you collect data? Again, very, very common approach across both natural and social sciences. How should data be processed? Again, common. And then finally, what do the process data actually mean? How do you interpret it? All of these things, as I continue to say, all of these things we learn. However, how do we actually go from the page of doing a regression analysis to say, how does this really work with what I, at the other end of this project, want to present? So, if you go through all of the wonderful research texts that you find around the world, you'll find that few of the authors give you instruction about finding or creating your own research question. They just said, this is how a research question is defined. Not how you think about it, not how you read about it for over a year and find that you've gone in a wrong direction. The process that's used by specific researchers to develop a research question continues to be an individualistic approach or an individualistic way of selecting. Many of us have projects that we continue over the years or project areas that we continue over the years, and then we find a methodological approach that's very comfortable to us. The methodological approach that's comfortable to me in the kind of research that I do are very simple kinds of statistics, simple regressions, really simple mean, mode, median kinds of data interpretation. That doesn't work with some of the projects that are econometrically heavy in public administration. Very recently in the United States, you may have seen in international news, an entire city in Michigan, which is one of the north central states in America, had a water crisis because the water was making the residents very ill. Children were being born with disabilities as a result. Younger school-age children were starting to, who were normal at birth, started to have very difficult behavioral problems that they traced back to a change in the water. It was not research scientists, it was not public administrators, it was citizens who did it because they thought about what was actually happening at that time and said, the only thing that we can see by a process of elimination was when we changed water sources. Sometimes, as public administrators, we need to take that very simple citizen approach to thinking through problems to help us find it. Sometimes, as academics, we need to step back from our heavy academic presentation and think very simply, what does this mean? And what is the best way to address it that would help me as a researcher and help the citizens or the practitioners for which I'm doing research? And oftentimes we don't do that. If we have invested 20 years in our education, we really want to use it. I know I did at first. I wanted to do all these heavy theoretical things to say I was this wonderful scholar. And I found that the questions that I was interested in as an HR specialist seldom necessitated those kinds of uses. So what may work best for one person may not work equally well using the same topic for another. All students learn differently. Therefore, as a researcher, as doctoral students, new researchers, you will have to find what you do best, what connects best to your area of interest and thought. How deductive or inductive an approach that we use as researchers take, or how we might mix these approaches. One of the examples that I'm going to show of my research combined a couple of methods to get to the answer of a problem. Those are the things that we need to consider, but those are also the things we can't find as a checklist in our methodology text. So, how do you, or how have you determined your research topics or questions? I know it's difficult to talk to people over RENET, but if there's someone in the room who wants to talk about how they determine their research projects, then we're welcoming your answer at this point. What I'm going to say is, as a new professor completing a doctoral program, I determined my research projects based on the areas I was teaching, based on my personal interests, those things that we are interested in as people, rather than academics, rather than researchers. We'll find we put lots of emphasis into. So again, the areas of human resource management. Social equity is a second area of research for me. Policies in social equity. What does it mean to be socially equitable in the administration of policies? What is the impact on citizens or certain groups of citizens when policies have not been equitable? Those are the things, those are the questions that I have in my mind. So those are the kinds of research topics that I approach most often. So in my own development, I had to think, what gets me answers to those areas? Definitely not a lot of heavily statistical methods, though sometimes I've had to look at that to get a clearer answer to my questions. Okay. Those of you on RENET, I really hope that you can see some of the smaller print. Research questions are our primary means or approaches to dealing with what we don't know, to get new information, to observe existing information. Where are gaps is probably one of the things that you as doctoral students have been told. What's the gaps in the literature? What has not been written about your topic? So to know what has not been written, we often have to engage in what has been written to see what was not answered well. Okay. A question that frames the literature review. Is there a theoretical framework that already exists? Theoretical framework, has someone already addressed a similar topic or this particular topic and did not go as far as you would like for it to go? My own dissertation looked at administrative policy making and citizen participation. What was the connection? Very simply, I found through interviews, through looking at a number of programs that had pulled citizens into finding answers, looking at very simple statistics, and again, surveying and talking to individuals, I found that administrators find it much easier to just develop a policy and implement it. Citizen participation is extremely time consuming. Citizen input is oftentimes seen as uninformed in my country. I don't know how it works in Lithuania, but professional administrators believe that I have a master's in public administration or I have a doctorate in public administration. I am well poised to answer these questions, so it's much faster for me to do it. But have we done a good job? A literature review, of which many of our theoretical research projects, as well as applied research, begin with, can answer a number of questions. If you have a question about a gap in the literature, if you continue to read, you might find just a lead in a footnote. And you go on and think, this question has been answered, although insufficiently. So these are the pieces that I need to do to add to that literature. Prior to this lecture, I had a brief, very informal conversation with a doctoral student right here in this room who is looking at the literature right now. And we talked about, can he find a particular model? Because of his area not being my area, it's like I'm not sure about e-governance, e-government. I have basic understanding, but not heavily theoretical understanding. However, I do have an expert on my faculty, so let me connect the two of you. Sometimes in reading other people's things, reading their books, reading their articles, you'll find the answer and say, that question has been answered already. Sometimes academics like to reinvent the wheel. They'll take one word and they'll talk about it for 20 or 30 years. And at the end of that 30 years, you'll find nothing new has been said. You've just done a lot of talking about the same thing. So start with the literature, and if you find that it's nothing there for you, then you know that you're looking at a new topic or a new approach to a topic. So again, I told you one of the scholars in not only research but in public administration, Samuel Yeager, in 2008, developed this checklist to help us move from not knowing what to do, how to think through a research question. He starts out by saying, before you spend lots of time, and I'm saying before you spend lots of time in trying to do something very sophisticated, even though you may end up that way, use this as a checklist. What is my motivation to do this research? Okay? And we'll talk about each of these one-on-one. What is my motivation to do research and to develop or decide on a research question? As a doctoral student, as a master's degree student, even as a professor, is it to get tenure? Is it to do something that I really, really am interested in knowing more about? Is it something to help a practitioner in developing a policy or implementing some kind of program? Is it something that I just want to know just because I want to know it? What's your motivation to do research? It's important to know that because that guides you in how you approach developing your research question. Where do research questions come from? Good question. Unlike, which comes first, the chicken or the egg, it's a little bit more easy to answer, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in detail. What are the different types of research questions? Are there explicit and implicit questions in the question that you are asking or the question that you want to ask? How do you create, clarify, and frame your research question to help you analyze it better, to help you develop data or collect data better? How are questions framed and determined for their usefulness? And then recognize that every research question may contain additional questions. What you may find is that your original research question may not be new or novel, but in doing your research, sub-questions have emerged that are new, that would help you further the field of public administration or further your research. So, what motivates you to do research? Is it curiosity? There's basic curiosity, which is general discovery. I want to know more about this topic. This topic is limited in the way it has been presented in a scholarly manner, or just limited in its presentation. Is your curiosity induced? As a doctoral student, your curiosity is induced, although your topic does not have to be induced. It's induced because it is a requirement to do a dissertation, okay? Generally, the requirement for the dissertation is that it be in the field. I am supervising 2 doctoral students who are very close to being done right now. They could not write a dissertation in math. That is not the field, okay? Even though that might be their really underlying interest. So they're induced to write, but they're induced within certain constraints, certain confines in the field of public administration, which is really, really broad. And because it's my area of expertise, within the field of policy, policy being extremely broad. One is doing on social welfare policy. Another is doing a combination governance and citizen involvement. How do you think about your research question? Basically, we talked earlier about reading the literature. What's in there? What's in textbooks? What piques your mind as doctoral students as you're going through your program? Many doctoral students come to the doctoral process in the United States with an area in mind that they'd like to contribute to, learn more about. Some come with that idea and find out through a class or through some literature that they are reading as a result or tangential to something done in the class that this is more interesting. This asks and answers more of the questions in the direction in which I'm going seeking new knowledge. So again, start with the literature, textbook, academic and professional literature. The journals in our field are very rich in a number of different areas. And as the field of public administration continues to emerge, we're finding that academic journals are also branching out. I understand that nonprofit or NGOs in Lithuania are fairly new. The dependence on nonprofits and NGOs is a new field in my country. So lots is being written about how to make those connections, what has been found from doing things already, what to do and what not to do, learn from experience, but also how do you take the theoretical knowledge from organizational leadership or from management or general public administration and apply it to understanding the work and the management within NGOs and nonprofit organizations. So you get research literature, research questions from the literature. You get research questions from practice and practitioners. I'm going to go back to the example of the Flint, Michigan water crisis. Questions were brought to practitioners in Flint, Michigan about the water, and they went to other people, natural scientists who tested the water and found what the practitioners wanted to find, that it was being pumped properly, that there were fairly, that the pipes were old, but that, the water was usable. The people who brought the questions to the practitioner said, you're not asking the right questions of the right people. There were some neighborhoods in Flint where they tested the water, by the way, at the site and not in the neighborhoods. Again, but they used what? Natural scientists talking to citizens. Where does the question originate? That's how you can start to formulate a research question. What would be the research question for the Flint, Michigan crisis? Is this water making people sick? Why is this water making people sick? Doing a broad analysis, not just at the site where water is purified at the water plant. We can always build on the work of someone else. In fact, most research, that's how we grow the literature in our field. Most research is based on something someone has already written. The ancient King Solomon said, there is nothing new under the sun. That was during Solomon's day, and I promise you there's nothing new under the sun. There's a new way of looking at it. There's a new way of dealing with it. So build on the work of others. Replicate a research project in a different setting and see if you come out with the same kind of answers. In the Flint, Michigan process, go out into different neighborhoods farther away from the center of the city. The pipes were newer. Closer to the center of the city, the pipes were older. That's where most of the problems were. That's where people were getting sick. So replicate a research project in a different setting or with a different population. Does it work better for men than for women? In the medical field, it has been discovered just in the past couple of decades that women's hearts function a little bit differently than men's hearts. So in looking at heart attacks among women, they found the symptoms to sometimes be a little bit different. We always came from the perspective, blood is blood, unless, based on the basic type. Hearts are hearts, hands are hands. But again, replicating studies using a different population found that we can't give women the same kind of treatment in heart attacks, or we can't predict heart attacks in the same way. In public administration, we still have some of those questions to answer, especially in terms of the new area of governance or network governance. Consider how various subpopulations may behave differently. You go from different populations to different subpopulations and see if there is a difference. And oftentimes empirical studies will do this. Again, do not preclude a positivist approach as a public administrator. There are times when we really do need to empirically show what we need to know, okay? Apply an existing perspective or explanation to a new situation. Can we take the words of Frederick Taylor, one of the founding fathers of public administration in America, and use it for network governance? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe how management has developed over time using words of people like Woodrow Wilson, Leonard White, Mary Parker Follett. We may find a kernel there. But if we go to the basic management literature, there may be an adaptation. So consider subpopulations, apply an existing perspective to a new situation, then You might need to explore findings that were unexpected or findings that are contradictory. Several years ago in the School of Public Administration, there was a doctoral student that did his dissertation looking at transportation in urban settings and how it promoted or assisted or not business development and growth. One of the things that emerged that he paid no attention to because he was looking for his research question was that there were populations that were so negatively impacted on certain transportation decisions. As one of the people on his doctoral committee, and social equity being my area of research, I said to him, did you look at this? No. Once he started to investigate that sub-question, that really became a more important dissertation question for him because that was the gap in the literature. Very, very, very little had been written, and that made him a foundational scholar in addressing social equity in transportation systems and the impact of where transportation policies on certain populations and on the urban environment where transportation systems are placed. Finally, challenge older research findings. Do they mean the same thing? You might find something very new. In challenging older research findings, existing studies, oftentimes you'll find that you can develop your very own research question that not only furthers the literature, but brings additional information, just as the example I used with the transportation study. To develop your research question, think about before you even start, is this a worthwhile question? Has it been explored until people want to really just kind of beg, you know? If it isn't, you'll find readers, you'll find additional input from other scholars. Sometimes you'll find a number of things. So is this question really worthwhile right now? Or am I doing something just to be doing something, which is a waste? Is the question answerable? Sometimes the questions aren't answerable. And sometimes we have to go through that process of finding out, I really can't answer. It's a conundrum. I really can't answer this question. Are there ethical issues involved in the research on this question? In the United States, we have an organization that is the IRB, the Investigative Research Board, that makes sure there are no negative impacts on human subjects. When you're studying human subjects, you have to prove that you're not going to negatively impact them. The reason for that happening, if you're familiar with the history of the United States, during World War I, African Americans, which is my ethnicity, were tested in the southern part of America, just like we use animals to find things out about cancer and that sort of thing. They were injected with diseases and not given medicine for it. So now we have to make sure that our studies do not negatively impact people while we are trying to find answers. So are there ethical issues involved? Is there a clear reason for asking the question? Is it clear to you as a researcher? Why do you want to know? Does it go back to your motivation? Why are you asking this question? Okay. If you have no answer as a researcher, maybe that's not the question you need to answer or ask. Maybe it's something different. That's why you go through this checklist up front. What's motivating you to do that? Where are the questions coming from? What is already known about the issue? What do you know? What do you need to know? Can you find it out? Do you need to do new research to do that? What assumptions exist in what you already know? What are you assuming? Do you even need to make different assumptions? We know that in both the natural and social sciences, we are told in our methods courses that we need to go into research with a clean slate, not making any assumptions, but being human beings in the back of our minds, we're saying, I think I have a direction because I'm assuming something. So what assumptions have already been made? You may not need to ask that question if the assumptions have been answered. How does the topic fit into exploratory research categories already? Sociology may have asked your question, however, from a different perspective. Can we take the sociological question and change it to a question that benefits our field of public administration in a different way? Same question, different application, different way of approaching the research. Okay. Early on, as you're conceptualizing your research question, develop a wide range of potential questions that you believe you need to ask, okay? And then do you go through and find out what existing knowledge is there on that topic, okay? These are the things that we already know. When you are thinking of your research question and trying to conceptualize it, these are the things you've been taught in your research courses. Is it an exploratory type of question that I want to conduct? Do I just want to explore general? Do I just want to find out general things about this question? Do I want to evaluate some basic things, or am I testing an existing theory? Okay, that helps with your approach to developing your methodology. Is this study going to be descriptive? Am I just going to talk about the who, what, when, where, how, and why of this issue? Or am I going to do something different, such as compare this issue using two different populations, using a number of different variables? That would be a causal kind of study. Establish that up front. If you have developed a question, now you're at your methodology section, you've gone through your literature review, you think it's going to be an exploratory type of study, and you get there and you find that having done your dissertation, I can do a causal or relationship study to compare and contrast, or to see how one independent variable impacts another. Then that's the benefit of doing literature reviews. That's the benefit of developing that list of questions that we talked about on the previous slide. So, sometimes you'll find in reviewing the literature to help you understand your question, or in developing your question, you'll find that some authors don't explicitly state a question. There was a research study done in political science that talked about the impact of voting in two different parties in the United States. after doing the findings for that, some of the implications for new research did not explicitly say you need to study the Democratic Party for this or the Republican Party for that. It was explicitly stated, and other researchers could, from this research, deduce that, this is a direction for my research. Sometimes you may want to have implicit rather than explicit questions. However, one point here that I make that is, I think, very important. If you're not explicitly stating your research question, recognize that unstated questions have to be sufficiently clear. They can't be ambiguous in their implications. Unstated or implicit question is not my area of specialization. I don't write in that manner. However, I have found it useful in my approach to research sometimes to help me see a different way of looking at a new way of researching something. We all get to the point where we have written and we have analyzed and we have worked on our research projects. So make sure that you go through the process of looking at what you have written. Revisions are often necessary. Sometimes you may have to go back through your methods because you find at the end something just was not right, which means that you either applied a formula wrong or you used an erroneous approach or an erroneous research methodology. So you may have to redo. You may find that you interpreted a variable erroneously. So always go back through and clarify when you're framing your research question as you're writing up that initial piece, because each type of question may suggest a different type of research. Make sure that you're clear in the direction that you need to take. Samuel Yeager, in his piece, this comes directly from the Yeager article, said that when you are clarifying or framing your question, look at the focus. If your question frame is discussing a who, then you need to identify who the who's are. Who are the actors? Who are the people that you want to look at? What's the location? What's the action taken? What is the cause? Again, all of these things you learn in research methods, but when you go through the checklist, you find that it's much easier to tackle your entire project. Finally, in looking at framing your research question, Lydia and Jean suggested that state the problem clearly and completely. You learn that in research methods. However, is the question logical, or is it abstract or heavily theoretical that nobody understands but you and your dissertation advisor? State the problem clearly and completely using terms that have a precise meaning. I'm sure this lecture may be a challenge to some of you that English is not your first language because you use words differently, the same words that mean very different things. We need to think about that as we're doing our research. Can the words we use be interpreted differently? Okay. There is, in a pedagogical text on teaching, an example that says the gardener drove the kids out of the garden and asked kindergartners to draw a picture of the story that was read, and the kindergartner put the gardener in a big Cadillac convertible and the children in the back to drive them out of the garden. That was not the context of the word. The context was shoo, 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 out of the garden. So we often write research questions that can be misinterpreted outside the field of public administration or even by our own readers when we use words that are not clear. Does the answer to the problem posed have the potential for providing useful and important information? Once you go through and clarify, you may find it doesn't. So maybe there's something else that I need to do. And then will the result be more than a simple exercise in gathering information? Those of you who are doctoral students and listening to this lecture, the challenge is to provide answers to the gaps in the literature, to pose new questions that have not been posed. Once you go through developing your research question and you find, well, somebody's already done that, you know, what's a different way of looking at it? What has not been done? What has not been said? So will the result of your study be more than a simple exercise in gathering data and answering a question? If it's yes, then maybe you need to do, I know for a fact you need to do something else, okay? All right. So I'm going to ask Luke, those of you who are watching, to help me bring up examples of motivations to do a study, going through a checklist of a couple of pieces that I did that I have published in the last decade. Less than that. That's it. Either one. Okay, we'll just do that one first. All right, and we'll do the other one next. So, teaching diversity in public administration. Diversity is a concept in the United States that refers to different populations, different subgroups. For us, teaching and managing diversity means, do you use things that will inform minority populations or the differently abled or those who come from different sexual orientations? Are we teaching our students in master's programs how to do that? How to write, how to teach in a manner where you encompass the needs of the entire population. So my colleague and I, Dr. Hewins Maroney, decided to look at this because we found in looking for textbooks, materials to help us do that, we didn't find it. Our search originally was to find programs in the United States that did have courses that would help us so we could talk to our colleagues, okay? We didn't find it. So we turned it into a research study. What was going to be our methodology? Our motivation was initially just to find out who had such courses. Then we decided our motivation still was to see, is this something that is done in the United States? To what extent is it done? So this was going to be a combination exploratory and descriptive kind of study. What we found, and look, how do I just scroll down to the methodology? Thank you. So since we figured it had to be exploratory, it's not working. Yep. Okay. I didn't hold it tight enough. I'm moving to the methodological section. We looked in the literature and we found that theorists were saying, yes, this is what we need to do in the United States. We need to make sure that we're teaching our students to understand the populations that they serve. We were saying it with our mouths, but we weren't providing a way or literature or methodology or textbooks or anything to help us. So what we did is that we used a mixed methodology. For this one, we just used a simple methodology where we looked at those programs that were accredited by the networks of schools of public policy and administration. This is the body that accredits, in addition to universities and colleges' regional accreditation, just programs at the master's level for public administration. It means that these programs have taken the extra step to assure that they are teaching in a quality manner and providing quality public administration education. These programs are evaluated on at that time, 7 standards for good public administration education. So we took their list of school and we just did random survey of a random sampling of them, pulling out 7 from the over 50, pulling out 50 schools from the over 200 schools that were accredited then. Nearly 300 are accredited now. But when we chose those schools, ironically, during random sampling, my very own school came up. What we did was we went into their websites, okay? We also interviewed or called the heads of those departments to say, do you have such courses? How are those courses titled? What are the resources that you use to teach those courses, okay? Then we went to their catalog, their book that described all their courses and told what books that were used. Okay. What we found was we knew already that my very own school didn't do that, okay? Okay. I'm going to show you the table, okay? Diversity courses by school or program. You see all the zeros there? That means no courses, no anything, all right? My school, no courses, okay? There were schools that were not happy when this was published, saying, what about your methodology? What about your this? But it was solid methodology that they didn't want their schools named, saying that they were not teaching things to help their students better understand the populations that they served. My school, UNO, is in the middle, University of Nebraska, Omaha. Look at zeros all the way across. This was not to shame anyone, but again, research to help us here teach better, okay? Better inform. All right, so that's one. All right, need to pull up the second one. The second study that was published in the Journal of Health Administration, that one, Two other of my colleagues and myself, can you make it bigger? What was the motivation for this study? The motivation for this study was to look at how African Americans, again, my ethnic group, how they seek or look for health care. Many studies had been done to show that African Americans do not get good health care because they do not go to doctors. And that's why they have more diseases, they're often more sick, and that sort of thing. As an African American, I said, it doesn't sound right, but again, as a researcher, you cannot make those assumptions, okay? So what we did was to look at how African Americans sought health care in our community and try to do it in a manner that would be generalizable. And you understand the research term generalizable, that you could apply that in places outside of Omaha. It was said that African Americans did not have health insurance, therefore they did not seek good health care, therefore they were always sicker. This was a simple go to health care centers that served African American populations, which was most of them in the city, and actually interview citizens. We asked questions about, do you have health insurance? Why do you come to this particular place? Very simple, seemingly unobtrusive sorts of things. Later in the process, we saw that the responses we were getting on our checklist of questions, we needed to also add a qualitative piece, because we were getting information from our respondents that really helped to inform this question and to see a very different side than what the literature had said. What came out of this study was that a number that the majority of people that we talked to, and we didn't randomly sample, we got permission from the hospitals, clinics. We did a clinic that served primarily people of color, meaning African Americans and Hispanics, and another healthcare center. And so we just asked people who were willing to talk to us. We got over 200 responses. What we found was that overwhelmingly African Americans did have health insurance. Okay. What we also found was the reluctance to seek health care was based in the studies that I told you about in World War I. African Americans, the majority of the people that we talked to had a distrust of the healthcare system. Many of them preferred to go to clinics in their neighborhood that had doctors of color, whether they were immigrants or African Americans or Hispanics, because they trusted them more, that they waited longer to go, and thus more pronounced illnesses because of the distrust of the healthcare center. This was a new finding. Could it be replicated? It was our goal to replicate it at some point, and we just have never gotten around to doing that, okay? But other healthcare providers have called us as researchers and said, so how do we address the mistrust? A study was done by Creighton University in Omaha where they did focus groups to see how they could better serve immigrants. So they brought the immigrants in and they found out things that they were doing that were antithetical to the culture of those immigrants. Just simple things that we do in America, like male doctors examining female patients. In certain cultures, that does not happen. So those are the kinds of things that we can do and the kinds of approaches and motivations that generate new research. New research came out of this based on the qualitative responses that we got, that we were able to add an additional section to bring that into this piece of research based on the responses, the verbal responses that we got outside of the checklist. So as public administrators, we cannot be constricted all the time by basic methodological approaches that are employed by either the hard sciences or even other social sciences. Okay, Luke, would you bring me back up, please? Okay, so as we end this presentation, hopefully somebody in the room will say something. If not, I will leave those of you on ReNet with some things to think about as researchers. Do you read the public administration journals? That way you know what has already been done or what has not been done. If you're looking for new and novel ways of doing things, what is the gap? Just like the gap in the study that we did of teaching diversity, that's how you know. We knew by going to the schools that taught to see who did or who did not. If you have subscriptions, do you read them? I get a couple of journals. I get a number of public administration journals, but I bet you know the ones that I read religiously and the ones that are on my shelf. The ones I read religiously are the ones that have articles that address social equity and those that address human resource issues. All right, every now and then I'll read an article that has policy implications and that sort of thing based on the title of the article, okay? But start out by reading what core public administration issues did the journal address. The two pieces that I showed you were in two different journals. The first piece on who taught diversity courses, what was contained in those courses was in a teaching public administration journal. The second one was in a health administration journal so that healthcare providers and healthcare administrators could look at the information. What core areas are covered in what you are thinking and what you are doing? Had we had, more doctoral students in here, I would have made them talk, and those of you on ReNet could hear their responses. Okay. Then finally, the final piece, as researchers or scholars or students, what are you inspired to study in order to contribute to the research of the field? That's a question that only you can answer. What are you inspired to do beyond even your motivation? Motivation drives you, but to be inspired is just that level higher. I have always been inspired to seek social equity in policies, policy making, in teaching. That's what inspires me to find that out and to find ways of promoting that. Okay, with that, I am done. I so thank the people who came today and was able to stay. I hope that this will be useful so that on some Sunday after you've read hundreds of articles, you won't sit in the middle of your living room floor and throw 80% of them out.
Dear Professor, thank you very much for your nice lecture about research methodology in public administration. I think that everybody who listened to your lecture found something very useful for themselves, as well as for all development of all science. I think we hope we will use your advices in the future for our new research proposals and projects. So thank you very much. And now we have the time for discussion. So dear colleagues, you are able to ask questions. Please, colleagues who are connected to Research Excellence Network event, by distance, please write your questions online in the chat line. We use this. While we are waiting for questions, maybe somebody from the audience would like to ask. They are still thinking. So if you would let me to ask you to the final question, when I saw it, I thought about you as a professor. Who inspired you to work in the field of public administration and to deal with some special problems?
I was inspired to do public service growing up in the southern part of the United States, the South. Those of you who are familiar with American history know that that was the geographical part of America that was not equitable in its policy making, equitable in its delivery of services, whether it was education or whatever, healthcare. Any service was not delivered equitably to populations of color. So in getting higher education, it was always my desire to find a way to inform public policy or to be a policymaker myself. I started out as a practitioner and thought that that would be my life, but it changed.
We are happy that it changed and you came to the field of public administration. Do you have any questions? I don't know. In the chat line, we still... Okay, so we are still waiting for some questions if they will appear in the chat line. So I would like to ask you one question, which is coming... We have the question from Latvia University, from PhD student and lecturer Ines Abalin. She says, coming back to multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary slide number 2, can you please explain once again what is the difference between them?
As Luke helps me out here, I totally went past them. In some disciplines, the words are used interchangeably, but here we're using them differently. Okay. Let me go back to there, that's it. Okay, so we're using multidisciplinary, meaning that there is an influence from all those disciplines that we talked about. For interdisciplinary, that means that I'm sorry, I'm doing it backwards. Interdisciplinary means that each one of those disciplines have a different approach to knowledge development. Multidisciplinary means that all of those disciplines or academic areas influence what we do. So that means that we have, from their interdisciplinary or theoretical approaches, we have influences that are hard scientific approaches, such as the positivist approach that I talked about, which is empirical analysis, that those who are empiricists or positivists show that you can only approach research by observing things and showing a direct relationship. We also have disciplines that say that you can qualitatively look at what people say and do that influence how we do public administration. So with all of these theoretical or methodological approaches, they sometimes come and they influence us by us either choosing one or finding in our studies that we can use several. The example that I used was that we use a basic empirical observation, but that we also talked to individuals as well. So we use qualitative and quantitative together, somewhat similarly with the health-seeking behaviors piece. I hope that answered your question.
So thank you very much for your answer. And could we go to the issue you mentioned a few times, reading of literature?
Yes.
I do understand that it is the main purpose of us to understand what is already known. And usually when we read some scientific papers, we can find the part which is called like discussion or limitations. Mm-hmm. What do you think? If we would read particular literature in the field and we would focus on those limitations and discussions, could it become a beginning of new research?
Most definitely. Reading the literature, seeing what has not been covered is the beginning of new research. Reading the literature and seeing what has not been covered well and challenging it is the beginning of new research. I often have my students read articles that were not written particularly well. And the reason for doing that is for them to analyze the article and to say methodologically, this is wrong. That gives them the opportunity to say, this is a better way of doing it, okay? Or based on the data that this author has, the conclusions are wrong. And then that leads to new research as well. Or based on who they did not survey, new research.
Could you disclose the secret where you find those examples of bad papers?
Any journal you read periodically has a bad paper, believe me. I often say to my students, many people, remember when we talked about what's your motivation for writing, many people write academically because they have to publish so much to get tenure. Even though they are reviewed by peers, periodically a piece will slide through because I am your friend and I am going to publish your piece and it's not very good. That happens in journals, believe me, more often than you know. So I say to my students, I know some of these people and I know why they published this. You want to do something different. So that's how all journals will have a piece that's not as sound as some of the other pieces.
You mentioned one more thing, curiosity or inducing some topics for PhD students especially. My question would be, is it bad to be induced by the department policy, by universities policy, by requirements? Or maybe sometimes we are induced by topics which are really important for the society?
No. Sometimes we all have to follow rules. We have to follow university policies. But once you become an independent researcher, you are no longer bound by that. The road to becoming an independent researcher is oftentimes having to follow the restrictions that are given to you by your department or given to you by your academic advisor or given to you by your university. But once you become free to do what you want, then that's different. So it's not always bad.
You mentioned, we saw 2 examples of your papers. The second one is talking about health-seeking behaviors issue, and my question is about methodology you used for this. You mentioned that you got about more than 200 responses from clients, from people getting those medical care services. What kind of instruments or channels of getting those responses you used during your research?
We used questions that we found that had already been validated, and researchers know that validated, valid and reliable questions. So we found questions that had already been validated. Some we had to vary the wording a little bit. So we used those standard questions. And that was going to be the only instrument that we used. We only used ourselves, who were professors, to do the interviews, okay, for all those interviews. So it took a while for us to do those interviews. But each of us found that as we had people answering those validated questions that we had found, they wanted to talk more. So we gathered information from their responses, and we found a pattern. There are a number of pieces of software. At that time, we didn't have any of that software. We just individually started to compile how many times we heard, for example, the word racism, how many times we heard the word distrust. And we saw that that was a pattern in most of those qualitative responses we found.
And one more question about research methodology. You are working in the field of public administration and having a very long experience in the field. So it took some time from your PhD defense procedures till now. Do you notice any changes in methods or strategies used in public administration researches? Or it's more depending on other factors like policy of department, school of scientists, or something like this?
I'm seeing, I'm taking the time to really think this through. What I'm seeing in American publications, and I don't read that many international publications, but what I'm seeing is more quantitative studies, earlier qualitative studies, but now we're drawing on the research methods from the hard sciences to help us. We're using econometric designs to help us understand things, and it's good. It's good. But I don't think we need, again, to just because we see more of these kinds of studies. There was a slide that I failed to use, but that I will send. University of Michigan doctoral students did an analysis of public administration journals to show what was the proportion of journals that covered things using a quantitative approach to research. And that's what they found overwhelmingly in those journals over the years, and they showed what proportion in just one slide. They very graphically showed how the larger or more, all of them are academically sound. I'm trying to say it in a way that I will be clear to you. The journals that have higher status, okay, they looked at 4 of them. Public Administration Review, which has the highest status in America. Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory, very similar. The Journal of Research on Nonprofit and Voluntary Associations, and I don't remember the 4th, but they showed more than 80% were using quantitative study methods. So
there are some changes in using methods and strategies.
Yes, definitely.
And Professor, we have one more question from Latvia. Ines is asking you one question. Could you please give an advice how to implement the theory into the practical part of thesis?
Very interesting. I'm going to answer it as succinctly as possible. I think when we are taking theory to practically apply it, we have to look at what are the real implications from the theory that we found. For example, when I looked at the first piece, teaching public administration, the theory of social equity says that in education, we need to be culturally sensitive, meaning understanding the cultures of various groups, but we also need to understand different learning styles from different populations and that sort of thing. And we took that and we said, nobody would know how to do that unless we taught them how to do it. So if the theory says we need to be able to understand different teaching styles, then we need to teach our students how to do that, and thus looking at who is really doing that.
Thank you so much. As I can see that we have no more questions online, so our colleagues here are still thinking about their researches, I think, and trying to adapt those ideas to their own cases. So thank you once more, dear Professor, for coming here to Researchers Excellence Network event to give us such a important, significant, and very useful advices how to plan, organize, and implement our researches. I hope that everybody working in the public administration field will use it as a very important, significant advices. So thank you once more for being here. All colleagues who were connected to Researchers Excellence Network event, thank you very much. We hope that we will see you in next events, which are upcoming next month. So thank you once more for being with us together. And thank you, Professor.